Pretotyping methods, part 2. In this lesson, we're going to look at 4 more pretotyping methods: the Pinocchio, the Infiltrator, the one-night stand, and the YouTube method. The Pinocchio method. The Pinocchio method is great for when you have a physical product or service that you want to test out in the market. A great example of this, which was the first known pretotype by the way, is the PalmPilot. This started back before mobile phones and all the wonderful ways we have now to track things. They were trying to solve this tricky problem of how do you track a calendar, appointments, address book, and contacts, etc. 2 companies tried to solve the problem. A guy called Jeff Hawkins at Palm and a small company called Apple. Apple did what Apple does and went about answering the questions: can we build this? And how do we build the best piece of technology? In other words, how do we build a prototype? They spent years and millions of dollars working on this particular product, the Newton, and then launched it, and was a miserable failure in the market. It failed because it was too big, too expensive, too complicated, and buggy. Jeff Hawkins at Palm took the prototyping approach. At the time, most of the technology didn't exist, but he trusted the law of exponential technology that says in 18 months' time or so, someone will figure this thing out and the tech would be available without him having to actually build it himself. So he skipped the prototype phase in order to ask, should we build this? Does anybody want this thing and will anybody use it? And the way he wanted to work this out was to answer 3 questions. Will they use it? How will they use it? And what will they use it for? And his hypothesis was that it could be a device in your pocket to track appointments and calendars. So he went to his garage and cut out a block of wood, took a chopstick, chopped off the end to make a stylus, and printed out an interface. He made a prototype that he went and then used around Silicon Valley. Every time he had an appointment, he'd take his block of wood out and his stylus, tap on his block of wood and look like he lost his marbles, and do this over a few months. And eventually, once he got the interface to the point where he thought it made sense, he gave it to a bunch of his friends and they used it and they tracked how they used it, and they eventually went off and built the PalmPilot. Now that ended up being the final PalmPilot, which is a massively successful product. And why it worked better than Apple's product? Because it was useful to people. And there was a simple thing. People at that time had pockets where they put the packet of cigarettes in and that kind of thing. And yeah, it weighed the same amount, it was the right size, it could fit into the pocket or the bag and those kinds of things. So really usable by people in the real world. So the Pinocchio method is very much where you're trying to test the physical product or service and see and measure if and how people will use it to solve their problem. This works particularly well in FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods, and in retail where we can simulate a product or test a product with customers in a real live situation. Next, there's the Infiltrator method. The Infiltrator is designed for when you have a good idea for a product or service or solution, but you don't have access to a specific cohort of customers. The question then becomes, how can you use someone else's customers to test your product? There was a company called WallHub. They were a design studio that came up with this product that you could stick on your wall and store your keys in envelopes. And they went to IKEA and they said, hey IKEA, I've got this product, would you like one? IKEA clearly didn't take the call because they get thousands of calls a day. So they got creative. Firstly, they renamed it to the WallHub because that's more like an IKEA product. Next, they went to eBay and they bought some IKEA staff shirts. You can see where this is going. Then they snuck into an IKEA and they found an empty shelf and they printed out some price tags and hung their products on the IKEA shelf and sold them. Sold in inverted commas. And by sell, I mean very irritated customers going to the counter saying, I want this thing, and the counter saying, you can't have it, we don't have it, where did you get it? And at this point, before that escalated, the creators stepped in and said, run an experiment, sure, we'll gift you the product. The product quickly sold out and they filmed the whole interaction. So now they have data. Come Monday morning, they phone IKEA and they go, hey IKEA, we have proof that your customers will buy the product. Can we talk? And IKEA says, how do you know? So they send over the video and IKEA says, yeah, you probably shouldn't have done that. And they say, yeah, we probably shouldn't, but we did. And we have data saying that customers want your product instead of us approaching you and going, we think people would like this. So IKEA eventually placed the order with them and sold their product. So there are obviously ethical and legal considerations here. That means it can't be used in every situation. And you have to be very careful with it. And obviously there are plenty of issues with this example. But it can be very helpful when you have a partner business or already in partnerships or relationships with external people where you can ask permission to test a product or service with their clients. The key is that the clients don't know it's an experiment, otherwise you don't get true data. An example would be like one of our clients who was an insurance company who happened to own a bank, and we needed to get access to a banking cohort of customers. So it was a great example of getting permission from a local close partner that we could go and run some experiments on. So that's the Infiltrator method. The next method is the one-night stand. The one-night stand prototype is where you're trying to test a one-off product or service whose value expires over time, like an airline seat. As soon as the plane takes off, the seat's worth nothing. Or hotel rooms, where an unsold room is worth nothing for the night. And this is how Airbnb got their start. They had huge trouble trying to raise capital, which you can imagine. We've got this great idea. What we're going to do is let strangers stay in strangers' houses, and don't worry, everything will be fine. It must have sounded like a mad idea at the time. The founders of Airbnb realized very quickly that it would be very difficult to convince investors unless they had data. So what they did is they went to Craigslist, they put up an ad for 3 air mattresses for $80 a night during an event, and they sold out quite quickly. This gave them an initial set of data to prove that there was something in here. And obviously they didn't jump from there to a $50 billion company, but they used this principle over and over of testing and gathering data and proving out their business case and the value proposition to potential investors. Another example of this is Uber again, which must have been another interesting pitch. Don't worry, strangers will pick up strangers in their cars and it'll all be fine. What could possibly go wrong? Doesn't sound like a very good idea, but many years later, it's once again a multi-billion-dollar business. And they also started by running experiments and prototypes and iterating until they had data to prove that the idea would work, and trying to find the smallest possible experiment to test and validate that this was true. So the one-night stand method is great when you need to prove whether people actually take action in a certain space for a limited time offer, despite what the common wisdom says. And the last method we'll talk about in this lesson is the YouTube prototype. And the YouTube prototype is fantastic for testing really complicated products or services that are difficult for people to imagine without it being in front of them. A great example of this is Google Glass. Back in 2013, they ran a YouTube ad that showed you the experience of using the product. So they'd show you how it can tell you your schedule and record things and jump out of planes and etc. But if you look carefully, you'll see they never ever show you the actual product, just the experience. Then in order to measure interest, they had this horrible form that you had to fill in, and there were all these fields and it was a bit of a pain, and you had to sign up, and eventually you get an email saying, give us $1,500 and we may or may not do this thing. So it was a huge leap of faith, and that was how they gathered data. They used a worst case scenario prototype approach. Now ultimately, this product failed, but it failed because of timing. So remember back in the market in 2013 or so, we didn't really film each other that much, and that was the primary resistance, if you can believe that. Now you can't even stop people filming each other. So a very different time, and timing really matters here. I think the product would have had very different levels of success if it had been tested at a different time, because the market just wasn't ready. So that's the YouTube method, which works really well when it's a complex kind of experience you're trying to simulate in order to get the experience in front of the customer and gauge interest and find a way to measure what they do versus what they say, without having to build the final product. So in this lesson, we covered the Pinocchio method, which is good for testing a physical product, the Infiltrator, which is good for ethically using someone else's customers to test your idea, the one-night stand, good for testing limited time offers and measuring what people will do, even if common sense might be saying something different, and the YouTube, excellent for simulating an experience of a complex product or service. All these methods are about seeing what people will do when presented with your idea, so that you can gather the data you need in order to iterate and run more prototypes so you can refine your products and services until you know you have something that works. We've got 2 more prototyping methods to run through in the next lesson, and then we'll build all those skills you need to run your own prototypes, which is the exciting bit.